Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a la conferencia ¿Quién fue el verdadero San Patricio? Durante la charla les solicitamos mantener sus micrófonos silenciados para evitar interferencias. El chat se encuentra activo para realizar preguntas y comentarios que le acercaremos al disertante al finalizar la presentación. Contaremos con interpretación simultánea al español. Para activarla, deben seleccionar el símbolo del mundo en el menú de Zoom y luego español. Damos inicio a la grabación de la sesión. Bienvenidos a una nueva edición del ciclo de Cultura y Estudios Irlandeses que se enmarca en la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas, creada en 2015 y auspiciada por la Embajada de Irlanda en la Argentina. Tal como se enuncian los objetivos de la cátedra, se promueve la difusión de la cultura irlandesa en sus manifestaciones lingüísticas, literarias e históricas, y en las de los inmigrantes irlandeses en la Argentina y sus descendientes. La Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur se propone el estudio y difusión de Irlanda, su cultura, su lengua, su literatura, su arte, su historia y su sociedad, entre otros aspectos, en particular en relación con la diáspora en la región sur de América. El estudio de la vida de los irlandeses en la región, de sus descendientes y de las comunidades que fundaron, de sus aportes a las sociedades de la región y contribuir a la preservación de su identidad. Buscamos promover la difusión de los estudios irlandeses y, a la vez, propiciar un ámbito de reflexión y diálogo entre Irlanda y Argentina y la región, en virtud de los vínculos que nos unen desde la literatura, la historia, las relaciones internacionales y los estudios culturales. El Centro de Estudios Salvador, en Uruguay, dependiente de la Asociación Civil Universidad del Salvador, se encuentra al servicio de la difusión y de la cultura y de la formación y capacitación de la comunidad. En conjunto, buscamos promover la difusión de los estudios irlandeses y a la vez propiciar un ámbito de reflexión y diálogo entre Irlanda y Argentina y la región en virtud de los vínculos que nos unen, desde la literatura, la historia, las relaciones internacionales y los estudios culturales. Mi nombre es Paula Ortiz, soy directora de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas de la Universidad de El Salvador y vicepresidente de la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur, AEIS. ¿Quién fue el verdadero San Patricio? En esta primera charla del año y en el mes en que celebramos al santo patrono de Irlanda, el doctor Damian Bracken abordará la figura del San Patricio histórico para desvelar, más allá de los mitos construidos alrededor de su persona y también en base a sus propios escritos, quién fue verdaderamente este santo y el valor de su influencia en la construcción de la identidad irlandesa. Le doy entonces la palabra al doctor Justin Harman, presidente de AEIS, quien a su vez presentará al moderador de la charla de hoy. Adelante, Justin.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Es un placer darles la bienvenida hoy. Este es el primer evento de este nuevo ciclo de eventos virtuales organizados por la asociación. Es el tercer año. Empezó realmente con la pandemia. Este es el tercer año y es un placer darles la bienvenida. Sobre todo un evento sobre el verdadero San Patricio, y tenemos el gran honor de tener un orador, un ponente que es un experto en el tema. Simplemente antes de presentar a nuestro moderador, Mariano Galazzi, quisiera decir que hemos arrancado el año ya con un evento muy importante, que fue la presentación del libro de Damian Bracken, que está aquí con nosotros hoy, sobre las relaciones entre Irlanda y la Argentina en el siglo XX. El libro fue publicado por el editorial de la Universidad de El Salvador y está en venta, y realmente la presentación en la Biblioteca Nacional fue un gran éxito y esperamos que haya una buena distribución de este libro importante sobre las relaciones entre nuestros dos países. Bueno, Hoy nuestro moderador, muchas gracias Mariano, por aceptar nuestra invitación. Mariano Galazzi es licenciado en Historia y Traducción y actualmente cursa estudios de doctorado en la Universidad Católica Argentina. También es jefe de la Oficina de Diplomas y Certificados de la Universidad Austral. Su investigación se centra en la historia de los irlandeses en Argentina, especialmente en la ciudad de Buenos Aires en el siglo XIX. Sus artículos y traducciones han sido publicados en Estudios Irlandeses y en Irish Migration Studies in Latin America, entre otros. Es traductor del libro Los irlandeses en Sudamérica de Marian Mulhall. Mariano es miembro de nuestra asociación y de salas. También es importante destacar este hecho que Mariano ha traducido la letra y el confesio de San Patricio. Muchas gracias. Le doy la palabra a Mariano.
Thank you, Justin. Buenas tardes, good evening. Una breve presentación del doctor Damian Bracken, que nos acompaña hoy. El doctor Damian Bracken es profesor titular en University College Cork. Es doctor en Historia, especializado en latín y en los elementos influenciados por el latín de la temprana ley vernácula irlandesa. Su investigación se ha centrado en la literatura hiberno-latina, especialmente en las obras de San Columbanus, el primer escritor irlandés que dejó un corpus identificable de escritos, y el primero en explorar la identidad irlandesa. Dr. Bracken investiga las obras de Columbano en el contexto de los ideales de autoridad y los conceptos de ortodoxia de la antigüedad tardía y la Edad Media. Ha sido docente en la Escuela de Historia de la UCC y en el Departamento de Historia de la Universidad de Boston y del Boston College, donde ocupó la Cátedra Brian P en Estudios Irlandeses. Editó conjuntamente Irlanda y Europa en el siglo XII, Reforma y Renovación, y el volumen de comentarios que acompaña el facsímil de la Schaffhausen Adomnán, espero que lo pronuncio bien, publicado recientemente como el primer volumen de la serie Manuscritos Irlandeses en facsímil. Les recuerdo que el chat se encuentra abierto para realizar preguntas y comentarios que le acercaremos al Dr. Bracken al finalizar la presentación. Le doy la palabra al Dr. Damian Bracken. Good evening, Dr. Bracken. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariano. Thanks for that very generous introduction. I hope people can hear me. Okay, so I'll try sharing my screen. Does that work? I wonder if people can see that. No?
Not yet.
Yes.
Okay, I'll try another way. Wait now.
Now,
There you go.
Excellent. Good. Okay, so thank you very much for asking me to give this talk. My friend and colleague Dermot Keogh, who you all know, speaks with great admiration of this association and the tremendous work it does in supporting Irish studies. So it's an honor to be asked to talk at this gathering. I'm going to talk, as you know, tonight about St. Patrick. And St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland, as you all know, but he goes to the heart of Irish identity. He's more than just a patron saint. And the 17th of March is more than just St. Patrick's Day. It's sort of Ireland's national day. And while everybody celebrates St. Patrick on March 17th, not very many people know a lot about the figure who's supposed to be central to this celebration. He's supposed to be responsible for converting Ireland to Christianity. He's supposed to be responsible for establishing the Irish Church. He's seen as coming to Ireland and confronting the political hierarchy and the political establishment. He's Ireland's first missionary, the first missionary to come to Ireland to spread the faith. He's Ireland's first bishop. He was commissioned to do that by the Pope himself. He came to Ireland with the approval and backing of Rome. And I finished that sort of that brief review of Patrick's CV, curriculum vitae, by saying that everything I've said there is as true as saying that St. Patrick invented green beer. He did none of these things. These are all part of the Patrick myth. So what I want to do tonight is to try to recover beneath the myths, the myths and the traditions that have grown around St. Patrick over the centuries. I want to try to recover something of St. Patrick, but more especially something of St. Patrick's character, insofar as that's possible at a distance of 1.5 millennia. The most famous tradition associated with St. Patrick is that he is responsible for kicking the snakes and serpents and poisonous reptiles out of Ireland. This is an account from an English or Anglo-Norman writer. His name is Gerald of Wales. He arrived in Ireland in the baggage of the English invaders at the end of the 12th century, and he went on to write a highly contested history of Ireland. And this is what he says about Ireland. Of all kinds of reptiles, only those that are not harmful are found in Ireland. Ireland has no serpents or snakes, toads or frogs, tortoises or scorpions. It has no dragons. Some indulge in the pleasant conjecture that St. Patrick and other saints of the land purged the island of all harmful animals. But it is more probable that from the earliest times, the island was naturally without these. I have heard merchants that ply their trade on the seas say that sometimes when they had unloaded their cargoes at an Irish port, they found toads brought in by chance in the bottom of the holds. They threw these toads out, still living on the land of Ireland, but immediately they turned their bellies up, burst in the middle and died, while everyone saw and wondered. The boot thongs are the lace, the shoelaces made of leather, also of that country of Ireland, are wont to be an effective remedy when cut up in little pieces and drunk with water against snake bites, the bites of serpents and toads. So if you're ever bitten by a snake, what you do is you get a piece of Irish leather, you cut it up, you put it into a drink, you drink it back, and you will be cured of your snake bite. I'm not sure if that's true. We have no snakes in Ireland. You might have them in Argentina, so maybe some of you might be brave enough to try an experiment. But the significance of this extract shows that for over 1,000 years, writers had been rejecting the myths associated with St. Patrick. 1,000 years ago, this writer is here. He's expressing his deep skepticism about Patrick and his miracles, or supposed miracles. This is the world that Patrick comes from. He came from this region here. We now call it England and Wales. Back then, there was no distinction. This is part of the Roman Empire. So Patrick was British. The British were the Aboriginal Celtic inhabitants of that part of the world. And when I move my cursor around the screen, I wonder, can people see that? You can? Okay. So he's from that region.
Yes, we can see it, yeah.
Great, thank you. And he is captured and he is brought to this island, the island of Ireland, inhabited by a people known as the Scoti, sometimes with 2 T's, sometimes spelled with 1. And those are the inhabitants of the islands of the Atlantic archipelago in Patrick's time. By tradition, he arrives in Ireland in the year 432, and that's another myth, I put that date up there because that's another myth which can be exploded. Patrick definitely did not arrive in Ireland in the year 432. And you might ask yourself, why therefore does Patrick continue to be recognized as a historical person? The reason is because of 2 works. One is a letter to a British chieftain called Coroticus. He crosses the Irish Sea from Britain, he captures Irish people, he brings them to Britain and he enslaves them. And the other work is a confession, and a confession was written by this individual in which he defends his life and his mission from attacks made on him. Both these works were written probably in the 5th century by a figure called Patrick, who declares himself to be British, and he's working in Ireland. So this is the concrete evidence for Patrick as a real historical individual. And what happens to this individual over time is it becomes encrusted with all sorts of legends. The character of Patrick is enhanced because he becomes a vehicle for the ambitions of pushy Irish ecclesiastics, particularly the priests of Armagh, who want a character who's heroic enough to be able to carry their ambitions. The only genuine information about this figure are those letters. Anything else is dubious. So the Patrick we think and we know has been sort of changed immeasurably over time. He's been invested with all of these traditions, all of these legends, and sometimes what Patrick actually says about himself in the historical record has been suppressed, where Patrick describes himself as vulnerable, where he describes his life as less than triumphant. That message is simply deleted from the record. So the Patrick we think we know about has been sort of Botoxed and airbrushed beyond recognition. You know, he is very much a creature of the centuries that stands between us and him. These works were subject to a study, well, they've been subject to many studies, but the most influential study done of Patrick as a writer appeared in the middle of the last century. Christine Mormon, who was an expert on medieval Latin, looked at Patrick's writings, and she published her studies in the 50s and 60s, and she had a very poor assessment of Patrick as a writer. Patrick's works show absolutely no literary style. There's no literary flair in what he writes. As a writer, he is not especially impressive. And if you were to say to Patrick to his face that you're not a good writer, he would have said, "You're absolutely right, I'm not." This is what he says about himself. Now, there's also a handout, I think has been distributed with extracts from Patrick's writings. I think it's available in the chat, but I've got most of the relevant extracts on hand on these slides if you can't get a handout. Patrick says about his own learning, he says that in his Confessio, he says, "For this reason, I had in mind to write, but hesitated until now, because I was afraid of exposing myself to the talk of men, because I have not studied like the others, who thoroughly imbibed law and sacred scripture." And down as far as line 20, he says, "The savor or the taste of my writing shows how little instruction and training I have had in the art of words." He goes on in the next line, he says, "When he was almost as a boy, not able to speak, I was taken captive. And because of that," the next line, 24, "today I blush and fear exceedingly to reveal my lack of education." So the first thing is Patrick is not a good writer. And the other thing is he is brutally honest about his background. Later on, if you go down to about line 97, he says, "I was attacked by a number of my seniors who came forth and brought my sins against my laborious episcopate." So he's here giving a record of the fact that he was attacked by his seniors in the British church because they know about his background. And he tells us this on line 103 there. He says, "As cause for proceeding against me, they found." So he reveals here that he's been the subject of some sort of tribunal of inquiry, some legal process has been instituted against Patrick. And the cause for that was, after 30 years, a confession I had made before I was a deacon. In the anxiety of my troubled mind, I confided in my dearest friend what I had done in my boyhood one day, nay, in 1 hour. So Patrick reveals here that he committed some sin. He doesn't tell us what the sin was. He says he was about 16 years old when he committed the sin, and it took him less than an hour to commit the sin. So your guess as to what Patrick actually got up to in that hour when he was 16 years old is as good as mine. There are all sorts of theories, one as bizarre as the next. But as you read this, it's sort of, whatever he did when he was in his mid-teens, he's still suffering from it and being made to suffer when he's an elderly man. So some of what he writes it's almost heartbreaking to read it. He goes on and he says that he revealed his sin to his friend. And his friend, like all good friends who are given a secret to, they revealed his secret. He says in line 110 there, the more am I sorry for my dearest friend that we had to hear what he said. To him I had confided my very soul. So Patrick, by his own estimation, is uneducated and he's a sinner. And that is precisely what the British bishops accuse him of. There's a question mark over Patrick's entire mission. And that question mark and that charge is made against him, we can infer from his own writings, by his superiors in Britain. They know that he is uneducated. They know that he hasn't, while his peers were studying scripture, as he says himself, he was in the west of Ireland, up a mountain, minding sheep. He reveals here that he was a sinner, and he is quite frank about the fact that he committed the sin. And he might as well, because knowledge of the sin is out there. Everybody knows about it, so he can't deny it. So the accusation made against Patrick is that he is unqualified to do his job. He is unsuitable for the job. He is incapable of being a missionary in Ireland. And Patrick's reply is he agrees with every single one of the criticisms made against him. So he says, yes, you're absolutely right. I am a sinner. I am uneducated. I am unqualified. I am unsuitable. I am incapable. And when he does that, while at the same time saying he is being remarkably successful, he has converted thousands of Irish people to Christianity, he's being extremely clever, because what he does is he puts his detractors in the position of having to explain his success. If by human standards, Patrick should have failed, and yet he succeeds, Patrick, by agreeing with those assessments, those negative assessments of his character and of his abilities, he's drawing attention to the divine origins of his mission. Patrick, by human standards, should have failed. His success, therefore, must have been because God is working through him. So when Patrick is being at his humblest, he's actually, don't take Patrick at his word. If you dismiss Patrick as a dunce, you will not have the last laugh, okay? So he goes on and he talks about, I don't think I have time to talk about Patrick and his women. If anybody wants to ask me about that in the questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer questions. Before I begin to look at Patrick's life, I just want to look at the world Patrick came from. We looked at the map just a few slides ago. That's how we imagine the world that Patrick lived in today. This is how Patrick imagined the world in which he lived. This is how people understood the world in ancient times, right up into the medieval period. And what you've got here is the central landmass composed of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Needless to say, this is before they invented North and South America. So this is the world as people understood it in the 5th century in Patrick's time. And it's surrounded by this all-encircling ocean, which in the ancient world, they thought of as a river flowing around the central landmass. And if you were to try to pick out Ireland on this map, it would be difficult. Although not as difficult as trying to find Argentina on this map, I'd admit that. But if you look on the map and you look at the very edges, the remotest spot on the map, that is the island of Britain. And beyond the island of Britain, so completely remote that it is literally off the map, that's the island of Ireland. There's another island beyond it, that's the island of Thule, which may be, it could be Iceland, but nobody lived there. So it didn't figure in these the geographic imagination of the inhabitable earth. So at the center you have, at the crossroads of the nations, you have a constant coming and going of people from across the face of the earth. People from every part of the earth gravitate towards the center, and they bring with them their ideas, their culture, their technology, their art, their learning. And that's what makes the center cosmopolitan. That's what makes the center civilized. Therefore, the more you move away from the center, the more you're moving away from the civilized center, until you get to Ireland. And when you get to Ireland, you're as far from civilization as you can possibly be, So therefore, that shapes the character of the Irish people. I've put St. Virgilius in here because, as I said, there's no people in the ancient world didn't believe there was anything in the southern hemisphere. What's in the southern hemisphere? Nothing. And if there is land in the southern hemisphere, nobody could possibly live there, because if anybody wanted to journey past the equator, they would simply be burnt to death. So no humans had ever made it south of the equator. So therefore, the regions south of the equator were uninhabited. Lots of people thought that, except you won't be surprised to hear the Irish. This is St. Virgilius of Salzburg, St. Fergal of Salzburg, Fergal of Ahado, believed that there were people living in the southern hemisphere. He got into a lot of trouble with the Pope of the day for holding that opinion, but that's another story. I'll just alert you to that before we leave that map behind. What you've got on this slide is an extract from another British writer, a writer who, like St. Patrick, was a Celtic Briton, and he's writing in the century after St. Patrick. And based on their conceptualization of the world, this is what this writer has to say about the Irish. He says, "The Irish are an exceedingly savage race from over the seas, who are like dark throngs of worms, who wriggle out of the narrow cracks, fissures in the rock, when the sun is high and the weather grows warm, who are readier to cover their villainous faces with hair than their private parts and neighboring regions with clothes." So this is an extremely pejorative and negative portrayal of the Irish by a British writer. And that throws into very stark contrast what Patrick says about the Irish. This is what Patrick writes about the Irish. And I should point out that Patrick is the first writer in history to describe himself as Irish in literature. The earliest person to describe themselves in literature is Irish. And this is what Patrick says about the Irish. He says, how did it come to pass in Ireland that those who never had knowledge of God have now been made a people of the Lord and are called the children of God? So Patrick views the Irish as the children of God. He doesn't see them as brute barbarians. He doesn't see them as savages. Where does that come from? What's his reason for doing so? And at this point, I want to begin to look at Patrick's writings. So what you have here is, you've got this in the handout, this is an extract from St. Patrick's Confession. This is Patrick's response to his British superiors who see him as unsuitable and unqualified for his work in Ireland. This is how he begins his defense of his life. He says, "I am Patrick, a sinner, most unlearned, the least of all the faithful, and utterly despised by many. My father was Calpurnius, a deacon, son of Potitus, a priest, of the village of Banavim Taburniae. He had a country seat nearby, and there I was taken captive." So Patrick tells us that his father was a deacon, he's a cleric, and furthermore, his grandfather was a priest. So Patrick is probably part of an ecclesiastical dynasty. Patrick was probably being trained from his earliest years to take up a position of responsibility in the church. But those ambitions were cut short because, as he says in line 6 there, "I was then about 16 years of age. I did not know the true God. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of people, and deservedly so, because we turned away from God." So that's a remarkable statement. Patrick, he is a Christian. If your father is a deacon and your grandfather is a priest, you're likely to be a Christian. So Patrick is a Christian, and look what he says in line 6: "I did not know the true God." What does he mean by that? And then he says, as punishment for disregarding the priests, he says on line 11, he was captured and taken to Ireland, as he says there, to the utmost part of the earth. He's brought to the very ends of the earth, which is where Ireland was. So the next step, this is on line 51 of the handout. He says, after he spends a period as a as a slave in Ireland. He says, and there at one night, I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, "It is well that you fast. Soon you will go to your own country." And again, after a short while, I heard a voice say to me, "See, your ship is ready." And it was not near, but at a distance of 200 miles. A few lines down, he says, I left the man with whom I had stayed for 6 years, and he escapes. I feared nothing until I came to that ship. So he receives a message that he should escape his master. He journeys for 200 miles. He comes to a ship, and he escapes on that ship. He says on line 68, he says, after 3 days, so he's on the ship for 3 days, and after 3 days, we reached land. And for 28 days, we traveled through deserted country. And those numbers are important, as we'll see in a while. And he says the people he was traveling with, they lacked food. So what Patrick does is he prays, and lo and behold, just at the end there, the last sentence, and with the help of God, so it came to pass. Suddenly, a herd of pigs appeared on the road before our eyes, and they killed many of them. So if you were to take those basic elements of what Patrick tells us about his life, and keep in mind that Patrick is, by his own estimation, he is not a good writer. He is not an inventive writer. And by the estimation of his ecclesiastical superiors in Britain, they would agree emphatically with that estimation of his limited ability. And also, according to some modern scholars, he does not cut a good literary figure. We put these elements of Patrick's life together. He's born a Romano-British Christian. He disobeys the elders. He is captured and he's made into a slave in Ireland. He's then given in divine instruction in how to escape. He escapes on a journey across the waters of 3 days. He wanders through the desert for 28 days. And during that journey through the desert, he is miraculously provided with food. Now, some of you might recognize what's going on here, because those stages that Patrick illustrates in his life might be familiar to you from the story of Exodus. In the Israelites in the Old Testament, or the Hebrews in the Old Testament, they are the chosen people. So the Israelites are the chosen people of the Old Testament. The Christians, Patrick's people, are the chosen people of the New Testament. But the Israelites of the Old Testament, they disregard God. And as a punishment or as a chastisement, they are made into slaves in a foreign land. The Israelites are made into slaves in Egypt. Patrick disobeys God. He is also punished by being made into a slave in a foreign land. For the Israelites, Moses emerges, and Moses is given divine instruction in how to escape and lead God's people out of slavery. Patrick also receives divine instruction in how to escape. The Israelites journey across the sea with dry feet, pursued by Pharaoh's army. And when they make it through to the other side, when they come out of the Red Sea, the waters close over Pharaoh, his army, and his chariots. They're drowned in the waters of the Red Sea. Patrick also achieves his escape by journeying through the sea. After the Israelites have escaped from Egypt, they wander through the desert for 40 years. Patrick journeys through the desert also, but for 28 days. And you can see you might be able to see the correlation here. The Israelites wander through the desert for 40 years, 4 decades. Patrick wanders through his desert for 28 days, 4 weeks. So 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 decades. And the Israelites are miraculously provided with food, manna from heaven, and a flight of quails, just as Patrick was. So what Patrick is attempting to do is he is presenting himself virtually as the new Moses. He is defending himself by saying that he is the Moses of the Irish. That makes him very, very difficult to criticize. I would say he's even going further. He's Moses, but he's even better than Moses. Back to this map again. This is a map of people's conceptualization of the world that they inhabited in ancient times, but it also represents their view of history. history for people living in the ancient world begins with the story of salvation at the center. You can see this cross. This cross marks the center of the world. This was, as you can see here, Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. This is where it all begins. This, in this region, is where Moses begins his mission. And for these people, the dynamic of history is salvation begins at the center, and history is about the spreading of salvation from the center across the face of the earth to the very ends of the earth. Salvation is going to begin at the center, and it's going to spread gradually outwards from the center to the very, very edges and beyond the edges. And that's what Patrick is doing. He is taking the salvation that starts at the center, and he is bringing it as far as it is geographically possible to go. So if history begins at the center, at the center of the map, history is fulfilled at the edges. Salvation history begins at the center in Jerusalem, and it ends at the edges in Ireland. So what Patrick is doing here is he is challenging these ideas that Ireland's remote geographic location is a negative. He's saying quite the opposite, that Ireland's remote geographic location allows it to take a central place in the realization and the fulfillment of salvation history. And Patrick knows his Bible. He knows what the prophets say about the fulfillment of history. The prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, therefore, glorify ye the Lord in instruction, the name of the Lord God of Israel in the islands of the sea. It's a biblical prediction, as Christians would have seen it, that the name of God would be proclaimed not just in the center, not just in Israel, but at the very edges of the known world, and beyond the edges of the known world, on the islands beyond the edges of the world. Isaiah 66, and I will set a sign among them, and I will send to them that shall be saved, to the Gentiles into the sea, into Africa and Lydia, to them that draw the bow, those who draw the bow are barbarians, into Italy and Greece, and to the islands afar off. So what Patrick does is he uses these biblical claims of universal salvation to make this dramatic statement about the nature of his own mission. Back to Patrick's Confessio, and if you look at line 121, he says that he is imitating those who, as the Lord once foretold, would preach his gospel as a testimony to all nations before the end of the world. So we have seen it, and so it has been fulfilled. And indeed, we are the witnesses, Patrick is claiming here, that through me, through Patrick, the gospel has been preached unto those parts beyond which nobody lives. For I am very much God's debtor, who gave me such grace that many thousands of people were reborn in God through me and afterwards confirmed, and that clerics were ordained for them everywhere, for a people coming to the faith, whom the Lord took from the utmost parts of the earth. Again, this reference to his geographic location at the ends of the earth. As he once promised through the prophets, to thee the Gentiles shall come from the ends of the earth, and they shall say, how false were our gods, and again were our idols. And again, that reference to the utmost part of the earth at the end of that section. So what Patrick is doing here is he is presenting the Irish not as these sort of barbarian inhabitants of the Limitroph regions, of the edges, as people who are peripheral in every sense, as utter barbarians. Patrick is presenting them as geographically peripheral, but because they are geographically peripheral, they're absolutely central to the fulfillment of salvation history. And that really dictates Patrick's attitudes to the Irish. He refers to the Irish on line 42 here on page, this is the first page of the handout. He says, he refers to them as my brothers and my sons, whom I have baptized in the Lord. And in his letter to Coroticus, he says on line 55 there, or my fairest and fondest brothers and sons, whom beyond numbering I have begotten or given birth to in Christ. And then he's writing this letter to Coroticus, who has come to Ireland and he has captured Irish people, and he has enslaved them. And the people he has captured and enslaved are Patrick's newly won converts. That's why Patrick writes this absolutely ferocious letter to Coroticus to condemn him. And he says, Coroticus is motivated by the fact on 959 there, for Coroticus and his merry followers, he says, it is a matter of disdain or disgrace that we be Irish. Coroticus and his followers refuse to acknowledge the Irish identity of Patrick's converts. And Patrick here he's describing not just his converts as Irish, he's describing himself. We be Irish. That's significant because that's the first time in literature, in the long history of the Irish literary tradition, that someone in literature has described themselves and identified themselves as Irish. So the first person in literature to describe themselves as Irish was British. There's some sort of poetic justice in that. And in terms of Patrick's legacy, and I just want to do this quickly. What Patrick does is he leaves behind everything. He leaves behind his status, he leaves behind his family, he leaves behind the familiar, he leaves behind his security, and he goes into an unknown land. And he's motivated to do that by the impulse of spreading his faith. In the centuries that follow Patrick, that becomes the defining characteristic of Irish spirituality. It's extreme asceticism. You leave go of everything. And in the centuries after Patrick, he unleashes a dramatic expansion of that Irish Christian world of faith and learning. What you're looking at on the map there is a very, very general map showing places on the continent where the Irish established a presence. From Britain right across Central Europe, that last dot that you see there in the extreme east, that is as far as Irish missionaries and Irish clerics got. That is an Irish foundation in Kiev in the Ukraine. That's as far as they got in the 12th century, bringing their faith with them. The greatest of all these Irish missionaries and scholars on the continent is this figure, St. Columbanus. He dies in the year 615, but not before he establishes a number of monasteries on the continent, 4 in all. If you were to take the influence and the impact of those 4 monasteries that Columbanus establishes, 3 in Gaul and one in Italy that we know for definite, and if you were to trace on a map the other monasteries that either adopted Columbanus's monastic rule and adopted Columbanus's monastic practices, or daughter houses from Columbanus's original foundation, that's what you'd get, from 4 to 119. And that is a truly dramatic map showing the extent of these people's influence. Just before I finish, I want to look at this foundation here, number 96. This is a foundation linked with a figure who by tradition was one of Columbanus's followers, the Irish saint, Saint Gall. This is his foundation in the city of St. Gall. The city is now called after him. This is the church dedicated to him. That's what it's like inside. If you look up and look at the dome, there you see the Irish saints, Columbanus and St. Gall. I'm presuming they're going up rather than down. They're on their way to heaven. This is the Stift. The Stift is a monastic complex which has the direct patronage and protection of the emperor himself. This area here is the monastic library. That's what it looks like inside. It preserves, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It preserves the most significant collection of medieval Irish manuscripts and manuscript fragments on continental Europe to this day. There's their 9th century list of books that they were very proud of. These are their Irish manuscripts at the beginning of the 9th century, the Libri Scoticae Scripti, the books written either by Irishmen or written by Irish in the Irish manner. And this is not an Irish manuscript, but it's significant because it contains a long, very long and long-winded letter by one of their inmates, the monk Ermenric, and it contains a life of this Irish founder, by tradition, this Irish founder, St. Gall. I want to look at this point and finish on this point. He asks, where does St. Gall come from? And he answers, he's come from Ireland. And he says, tell us about Ireland. And he says, well, I'll tell you about Ireland. He says, in Ireland, it never snows. And if it does, the snow stays on the ground for just 3 days. Now, this guy's in the Alps. He's surrounded permanently by snow. And he hears of an island where there is no snow. And he says, not only that, they have no snakes. You know, no snakes, no snow, sounds like paradise. And he says, well, it is. He says, so much so that if you're ever, it's such a healthy place that if you're ever bitten by a snake, what you do is you get an Irish book. And you get an Irish book and you scrape the pages and you gather up whatever you've got from the pages, you put them into a drink, you knock it back, you drink it back, and you will be cured of your snake bite. I know, you know, if you're going to do an experiment, I'm sure you have Dermot's book, you might want to give it a try and see if it works. But then he goes on and he says, do we actually believe that? Do we actually believe that that will happen? And he says, no, obviously this is a myth, this is a legend. What does it signify? And he explains its significance here. He says, indeed, what do the leaves of books and everything from that same island of Ireland, which resists poison, signify, but that every divine word spread anywhere from there, from Ireland, holds off and drives out vices introduced by the devil and brings about eternal salvation. So that's how the Irish are remembered by this continental writer, as bringers of books, as bringers of enlightenment, as bringers of faith. And that is ultimately Patrick's most lasting and enduring legacy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bracken. Abrimos ahora el espacio para algunas preguntas. Les recuerdo que el chat está abierto para realizar preguntas o comentarios que las sacaremos a Dr. Bracken. Voy a empezar con unas preguntas mías. I will start with some questions of mine about what you said. Thank you very much first for your decision about Patrick's life and significance. And my first impression when I read St. Patrick's letters some years ago, when I tried to translate them, it was an image that called my attention was that of a very strong personality, a man although he shows himself as humble, but he also shows all the things he has done and all the things he has attempted to do for the Irish and for God. And when you translate the words of St. Patrick or any other person, I suppose that it's sometimes difficult to think or to imagine how life was in those times. So to understand sometimes what he's referring to, or what he's trying, or what is behind those words. You mentioned some things that may be behind those words, but when you approach texts from those times, as you have done now, what is the way you approach them, or what's your experience when translating or when trying to dig into those deep layers of texts so old and so remote to us?
Yeah, Patrick wouldn't be the one I choose to base my answer on because these texts they're written in a different time, but they could be written by somebody from a different planet. They are, to a modern readership, they're rebarbative. I mean, they're very, very alien. That's why Patrick is so unusual, because there's an extraordinary emotional charge to what he writes. you could tell his anguish still comes across clear as a bell, even at this distance of one and a half millennia. So although Patrick is writing from a very remote period in history, you get the sense that you're dealing with a real individual, an individual who has experienced life. He's experienced the difficulties of life. He's experienced the tribulations of life, but he is very much motivated by a mission, literally motivated by a mission. And ultimately, that's what makes him accessible for a modern readership. And that's what opens up Patrick for me. Anytime I go to read him, that's what makes him sort of so appealing, I think, and accessible for a modern reader.
Well, in some way, that was the next question I was thinking of. Patrick went to a land where he had been a slave to preach a new religion among people who were, although he knew them well, from a different cultural world, let's say. He had no military support or economic support, but he was highly successful. He traveled a lot, he gained many converts, organized an important church, and he seems to be a very determined man and with a high level of resilience after his difficult times as a slave. Yes, sorry. My question was his complex personality or his compelling personality. You mentioned some of them, some things a moment ago, but my question was what aspect of his life or his personality most appeals to you, or you think is more relevant for us today?
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, I mean, he's a deep thinker, but he's also extremely practical. He says that he has to acquire resources, and I mentioned Patrick's sin in the presentation, and there's sort of whatever that sin was. The fact is that there is a sensitivity about the use of resources and his use of why was he in this business? Because I think he must have been accused of being in this evangelizing the Irish for his own gain, that he was lining his own pockets. His reaction to that is he says that he had to do this because, just to get back to the issue about his practicality, he says, I had to pay the sons of Irish rulers. I had to pay them. And presumably he had to do that because he needed some protection. As you said, he was coming into a land where nobody knew him. And in the world we're looking at, 10 kilometers from your own front door, you are a foreigner. Nobody knows you. You have no protection. So what Patrick had to do was he had to use his resources to give himself some protection and also to give himself some status. If he's able to gain the resources to go around Ireland with a retinue, that gives him some status that ensures that he will get a good hearing. So while you have behind Patrick, you have this highfalutin theology, he's also an extremely practical individual. He knows what he's got to do. He knows what he's got to do to succeed. And this whole idea that he is humble, he is. There is that humility, but even there, I won't say he's playing games, but there's a very studied aspect to what Patrick does when he presents himself as humble, because when he's doing that, he's appealing to another biblical example, another biblical type, another preacher who's in the Bible, who goes to spread the word, this time among the Gentiles, and who was also accused of being unsuitable, of being incapable, of not having a way with words. And that's St. Paul. Paul says that I could have gone to preach the word using highfalutin theology, using elaborate words. I could have won my audience over with the sophistication of my expression, but he says I didn't do that because I wanted people to follow me, not because I have a way with words, but because I'm preaching the truth. So when Patrick uses his awful Latin, and if you've studied his Latin carefully, it is a bit so it is difficult Latin. You just wonder to what degree his bad Latin is also very studied.
There's a question also in the chat that I think is might be can be referred also to the way we were just talking. Why did you feel compelled to study St. Patrick or the times of St. Patrick? You're an expert on, or you're studying more on St. Columbanus or his influence or his writings. What made you interested in that period of Irish history or Irish influence in the rest of the world?
I think when I did my undergraduate degree at UCC, and we had some really extraordinary teachers. One of them was Jennifer O'Reilly, who opened up this world for me. Another was Donald Corcoran. So they presented a picture of Ireland's past, which was absolutely compelling. And when you look at I mean, what I've done in St. Patrick is just scraping the surface. When you're reading someone like Patrick, you will never get to the bottom, because once you dig through one layer, there's another beneath it, and there's another beneath that again and again, and that's, you know, when the Irish acquire literacy, through Christianity, it doesn't take them, you know, a century or two to work up to a degree of sophistication. That degree of sophistication is there from the very beginning, and it's there with St. Patrick, and if it's there from the beginning, it sort of that culture, that compelling culture, becomes even more compelling as time goes on, until you come to the, you know, with Columbanus and writers who follow him. It's a deeply attractive picture that they paint. You know, it's a great privilege to be able to study their works.
And you mentioned that the only way to know the real Patrick, at least to a certain degree, is what he wrote. But also there are many legends that illustrate his life, but cannot be taken at least completely seriously. But there's also a question about the places where St. Patrick preached or where he lived, and because there are many places connected with his life, and to what extent can those connections be considered more or less reliable, or at least with some truth behind?
Yeah, they can't. We're feeling well. One thing that can be said is in the northern part of Ireland, in the northeastern part of Ireland, the place name evidence suggests an ancient association with St. Patrick, so it's quite possible that he was in those regions. The only thing he gives us himself, he says he was near the wood of Vucklut. Again, where that is, there are all sorts of interpretations about where that is. He says that he had to journey for 200 miles to reach his boat to escape. So presumably that's somewhere in the west of Ireland, if it's 200 miles from the east coast of Ireland. The place he's born in, he says he was born in Benavente Bornei. If anybody knows where that is, please let me know, because nobody's given a good explanation of Patrick's birthplace. So that's also a mystery. So when it comes to St. Patrick's world, it's difficult to reconstruct that world, but we can tell a lot about what went on inside his head.
And also well, he was born in, you mentioned many things about mentality and culture and the influence and what was to be inside civilization and outside civilization. But for a man like Patrick, also it might have been challenging for him to change his mind, to become himself, to feel like an Irishman.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I suppose that you also mentioned the influence, or in some way a legacy of St. Patrick through all these missions in Europe, St. Columbanus and many others. What is there any sense that perhaps his personality has influenced the way that the Irish are today? I mean, sometimes the Irish are presented as an emigrant country, where, well, the destiny of Irish is emigration sometimes. which is not completely true, but in some way that maybe or not, maybe not, but other characteristic of Irish personality that can be traced back to St. Patrick's time that you can find.
Well, what Patrick, as you saw at the very beginning, he discusses his background, and he talks about the fact that he was taken captive in his father's place in the country. So if your father has a country villa, you're doing okay. And Patrick draws attention to his high status throughout what he writes, but he turns his back on it. He first of all, he has no choice because he's captured by the Irish, but then he ends up back in Britain, and he gives an account of this extraordinary vision. He says he had a dream, and he said the dream was he dreamt of a letter coming from Ireland, and this is an unusual letter because it's a talking letter. He calls it the voice of the Irish, and he says that letter spoke to me, and it said, come back and walk among us once again. And Patrick then says, when I was reading it, I was broken at heart and I couldn't read any further. I had to put it down, and he realized that he had to go back to Ireland. And that's what he does. He turns his back on his family. He turns his back on his very comfortable, privileged status. He says he's freeborn. That's 5% of the population living at the time were freeborn. And he turns his back on the security of, a roof over his head. He turns his back on the security of being in the part of the world that he's familiar with, and he goes to Ireland. And that rejection of the worldly, or that rejection of the mundane and the familiar, you might recognize as a very monastic view of life. It's a very ascetic monastic view. And that is a characteristic feature of early Irish Christianity, this sort of rigorous all or nothing asceticism. And that is there from the time of St. Patrick. And in the generations and the centuries that follow him, the Irish play that in reverse. They leave their homeland and they journey to the continent. And on the continent, they're known as peregrini, peregrini per amore Christi, pilgrims for the love of Christ. And some of the continental sources say that they don't even use the word Irish. They simply use the word peregrinus. And a peregrinus could be a pilgrim, or it means a person who journeys around. And the word, when you come across it in the medieval sources, peregrinus means Irishman. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, the Irish themselves were defined as a people who move around a lot. They're immigrants. That's part of their history. So Irish immigration isn't immigration is not a modern feature of the Irish experience. It's a defining characteristic of Irish identity from ancient times, from the time of Patrick.
Thank you very much. And I think there are no more questions pending from the chat. And I think I want to mention the fact that although in Argentina was 6 o'clock in the evening, but in Ireland it's much later. And another reason to thank you very much for your presentation today. And well, I think it's if there are no more questions, I think we can just end by thanking you very much again.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Veronica or Justin?
Well, muchas gracias, doctor Damian Bracken. Ha sido una charla sumamente interesante y con temas que desconocíamos, así que nos ha enriquecido mucho toda la información que nos ha brindado. Les agradecemos entonces a todos su presencia y los invitamos a visitar el sitio web de AEIS, de la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la USAL y del CES, donde publicaremos más información sobre los próximos eventos. Nos encontramos en el próximo encuentro y nuevamente muchas gracias a todos por su presencia.
Muchas gracias. Many thanks, Damian. And good evening to you. And good evening to you in Cork. That is a fascinating lecture, for which many thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.